Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the National E-Learning Center podcast series about digital credentials to promote trusted online learning for all. Today, credentials play a critical role in recognizing the competencies earned by the learners, especially with the phenomenal growth of online learning for upskilling and reskilling. It is essential for us to understand the role of digital credentials in the life learning process and ecosystem. So, in this special podcast series, we will explore aspects of credentials from innovation, standards, and policymaking, and their impact on bridging between the labor market demand and supply from the perspective of academia and industry. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Albert, Assistant Research Professor at George Washington University. Without further ado, let's welcome our guest to the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Albert. May you please tell our listeners more about yourself?
Yes, so I'm an assistant research professor at George Washington University. I guess I'm best known for managing the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network. I often go by the acronym NCRN, which is a community of now about 360 researchers and stakeholders. Study or use data on microcredentials. When we talk about microcredentials and non-degree credentials, the term is very similar. That includes things like apprenticeships, certifications, certificates, licenses, badges, which I'll talk a little bit more about later about just kind of how there's a lot of issues around how we classify credentials in the United States, and our members are trying to figure all that out.
Interesting. So, in the past 5 years, what have been the major developments in the collection of data on microcredentials in the United States?
Well, over the last 5 years, maybe really over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of advances in survey research. The United States government has funded several surveys, nationally representative surveys, that for the first time have allowed us to really have a nationally representative estimate of how many microcredentials are out there, certificates, certifications, licenses. And these surveys have told us a bit about the labor market value of credentials. We, for the first time, also have real concrete evidence of the labor market value. We know that people who earn certifications tend to earn more in the labor market. And from surveys from the Department of Education, we can actually say that there's actually the earnings benefit is not just because more savvy or more motivated people earn those certifications, but because there's value intrinsic to the certifications themselves. It appears that there is not just a selection effect. So those surveys were launched by an organization called the Interagency Working Group on Expanded Measures of Enrollment and Attainment. They went by the acronym GEMINA. They included the Adult Training and Education Survey, which collected data on certificates, certifications, licenses, and what they called work experience programs. There's a new survey called an N2s, National Training, Education, and Workforce Survey. That's being launched by the National Science Foundation and the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. Again, that will actually have a longitudinal survey design. So we'll be able to see whether people who earn a certification in 2021, how much do they earn in 2025, 2027. We'll be able to follow those people through the decade, through the 2020s. So we'll actually have a lot of data, a lot more data, and looking forward 10 years from that. State longitudinal data systems have been another area. Almost all 50, 49 of the 50 states now have a data system that uses administrative records on who has graduated from universities in their states, including certificates. We can see if those people earn certificates, if they earn more in the labor market. And we know how much they earn because we're using tax records to actually see how much they earn. So that's been another major advance. And those have really come into their prime, I would say, in the last 5 years.
So what are the major challenges within collecting these data?
Well, one major challenge is that I think we don't have a great taxonomy of non-degree credentials. We know the major buckets. We know that there's certificates, which are usually based on some type of course of study. We know there are certifications, which usually require some sort of examination, some sort of demonstration of competency, and are time limited. Usually you have to renew those certifications by doing some kind of continuing education activity or taking an exam again. There's licenses, which are usually based on an assessment of competency, but are administered by the state, as opposed to a private organization. Obviously, we have apprenticeships as well, but we don't really know often where does a badge end and a certificate begin. Within this world of certificates, there's huge variation from things that might be completed within a day or two, where somebody just goes through a simple workshop and gets a certificate at the end of the day, versus something that might require a year or more of university study or study in the community college system. So right now, it's our data systems, we tend to code whether people have a certificate or not, and the data is a 1 or a 0. You have it or you don't. I think that obscures, the huge variation we see in the quality of training providers, the rigor, and the extent to which these credentials ultimately represent competency. We know that there are some certificates and some training providers that just don't offer that level of quality that you would want somebody, for example, maybe somebody providing care to your family or somebody providing an essential professional service. Somebody, as a society, we rely on the competency, that we rely that we must trust, that people who have these credentials are qualified to do what they say. And it's a real problem, I think, that we have this variation in quality, and we're trying to figure that out. There's disagreement, I think, within the United States, within the research community, on what do we prioritize when we say that a credential is of quality. Some systems some ways of looking at quality really focus on outcomes. Can we look at, say, the credentials of high quality if the people who complete it earn more? For some cases, it's more related to, can we measure the qualifications of the instructors, perhaps? Or maybe we can say something about how the institution is operated. Lots of different ideas out. And as a research community, I think that's been a challenge for us to all get on the same page and, have consistent definitions.
Maybe having a verifying agency that can governance the credentials will solve this problem. What do you think?
Well, there are accreditation agencies in the United States. There's many accreditation agencies. The problem is that a lot of microcredentials do not fall under the purview of those accreditors. A lot of certifications, in particular, industry certifications are issued by a trade or a professional association. Only 10 to 20% of those certifications are actually accredited by one of the two major organizations that are responsible for accrediting professional certification bodies, Institute for Credentialing Excellence and the American National Standards Institute. Unfortunately, for a lot of credentials out there, because they're offered by private, sometimes for-profit firms, sometimes nonprofits that have a little bit of an entrepreneurial interest in trying to credential as many people as possible. There's really that challenge. The challenge is not the universities. The universities that are where students are eligible for financial assistance for their studies from the government, they're not the problem. They're all accredited. It's really this world of unaccredited credential providers that's, I think, especially, I would say, compared to other countries, is especially large in the United States. And, we rely on the market to decide the quality of some of these credentials. And some of them, employers may decide that these credentials are not of high value. Problem, of course, is what if the individuals seeking these credentials don't realize that? What if they see a video on TikTok? Or what if they just go to the first page of results on Google, which may be advertisements, trade schools, credential providers that may, like I say, some of them are good. Plenty of very good, high-quality credential providers advertise. Problem is identifying those bad apples.
And still learners are getting these credentials. From your point of view, why do you think these learners are still interested in these micro-credentials?
I think there's a couple factors at play. One is simply that many learners don't know where to find high-quality information about credentials. Even though some states have done a good job of creating data products where, using those state longitudinal data systems I talked about earlier, they're able to track outcomes associated with certificate programs, especially in the public institutions. A lot of these private institutions, all these private training providers may not be reporting data that can be easily tracked by these data systems. I think also a lot of learners just simply don't know. They don't know where to find the good information. They don't also have access to high-quality counseling. High school counseling in the United States, although most high schools provide some sort of career or guidance counselor, most students have some sort of access. It can be quite limited. In a lot of high schools, students might only have a couple hours to discuss their future with a counselor over the course of 4 years of schooling. And once they're out of school, oftentimes there's nowhere to go. There's no honest broker they can turn to really get ideas about what can they do, what's a good pathway for them. They lack that personalized advice. I think also the other factor to mention is that in the United States, we do have a high level of income inequality. A lot of students feel like they're probably stuck in dead-end jobs. Sectors like, I don't want to generalize, but there are a lot of low-quality jobs in the retail, hospitality sectors, for example, in the United States. And I think that on some level, people are even desperate, I think, to get out of those jobs. And they're willing to they're sometimes willing to take a risk. They're highly motivated to find a credential. If they see an advertisement, they see the promise, they think that this is the pathway into a higher paying profession. They're tempted to go for it. And sometimes, unfortunately, they don't do their research.
You mentioned some learners are unfamiliar with the appropriate pathway. What do you recommend that they do to identify high-quality credentials?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a single data system that covers all microcredentials. That's still several years out in the United States. That's an opportunity for the future, but it's not where we are now. Some states do have data dashboards that are published online where you can look up information. For the certifications and licenses, the Department of Labor does publish a certification finder and a license finder that provides some information that individuals might be able to use. I think individuals also should talk to employers. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good surveys of employers, but ultimately employers are the ones who are going to decide if a credential has value in the labor market. And I think that people need to look at what are the employers requesting, what are they demanding. Job postings data, especially maybe it's not quite there now, but there are projects like the National Labor Exchange, which is a project to bring together really massive amounts of data from job postings, job descriptions posted by employers to employment websites like, for example, Indeed. They have 4 million job postings there at any given moment. And as I think researchers figure out how to work with that data, I think I'm very optimistic that we will have a better sense of what are the credentials that employers are demanding and which credentials are associated with long-term economic mobility, which ones pay the most tomorrow for the person who earns that credential, but which ones have value 5 years, 10 years down the road.
Lifelong, yes. So will digital badge solve this problem? And how do you think this will be solved, if so?
That's a good question. I think that badging has value certainly in the verification of credentials. I think that badges have some potential for improving our data systems if we can get to a point where people can share their badges easily with researchers. Oftentimes when Americans hear the term badge, I think they are associating that with just simply short-term sort of certificates, really. And that's a bit of a problem. The badging technology is great. Badges themselves, it really depend if you're thinking about how many American learners define a badge. It's just a credential that may take a few days to a few weeks to complete. There can be value, certainly, but I don't think that workers should expect miracles in a short period of time. Certainly, if they're learning technical skills that employers are demanding, that can be really valuable. But from what I see and what I've seen in some of the research I've done myself with data from our public workforce system, credentials that are under a few months, usually they don't have a lot of value.
Going back to the data collection, I'm sure there are some opportunities. So what are the biggest opportunities to improve data systems?
Well, I think we're on the cusp of some major investments in data systems. I already mentioned that, as each year that goes by, we get more and more longitudinal data from those nationally representative surveys, especially those that were started in the last decade. The National Labor Exchange Research Hub is another major area. That's a bank of job postings that I think that once researchers figure out how to parse that data better, how to flag and identify individual credentials in that massive data set, I think there'll be some real value there and some ability to really, really help learners identify those credentials that employers are demanding. Major opportunities in building better data tools, data dashboards. Like I said, with the state longitudinal data systems, those state data systems are doing better every day, definitely every year. They're doing better and better at capturing data on microcredentials. Coverage of microcredentials in those data systems is only going to increase over time. So I think there will be a lot of really exciting data products coming out in the next 5 years or so that will really help learners at least help them weed out some of those lower quality credentials and make sure that they're really that they're focusing their effort and spending their money and spending the government's money, spending taxpayers' money on credentials that are of value.
Dr. Albert, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the National E-Learning Center podcast with your host, Al Hanouf. We hope you enjoyed our episode about the state of data and research on microcredentials. As always, you can visit our website, nelc.gov.sa, to know more about our news. And don't forget to check our resources page. That's it for now. See you next time.